All right, Stephen Horn is back to tell us about sentencing. Man defended by EC attorney sentenced to probation for role in January 6th attack. Stephen, you have been arguing since the beginning that you were at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021 as an independent journalist and that you should not face any punishment for that. But I know there was concern when you were on last time back in, I think it was August or September, about potentially going to jail for a significant amount of time. So you just got probation. I guess the first question I have for you is, how are you feeling now?
Well, it's definitely nice to not have that hang over my head. Now I've been sentenced to probation, so I know what I'm in for. It's a little unnerving to have something like that where you don't really know what's going to happen.
What were you facing? Was it something like 10 months in
Yeah, so
jail?
the DOJ requested 10 months of incarceration for the sentence, and the U.S. Probation Office recommended no incarceration. That's what we were asking for as well, and that's what we ended up getting. So,
Mhm.
to even get to 10 months, basically what the DOJ had to do is argue that there's like a 0 point offender status, where basically the severity of the charge is brought down in terms of sentencing if if it's basically your first offense. I believe that's what it is. So they're basically arguing, that shouldn't apply to my case because January 6th was so serious. But, the judge rejected that argument, applied the sentencing guidelines as we thought they should be applied. And then he also adopted the sentencing that we are recommending.
When I read articles from locally in North Carolina seem to be a little bit less biased. The farther you get away, I think, in the national reporting about your case, it gets more like this. This is the Washington Post. Jury convicts January 6th defendant who claimed he was reporting at Capitol. There's the picture, the famous picture that I've showed a couple times too. And one of the things that the FBI said, not the FBI, yes, the FBI in their case, was that you were shouting stuff like America, America. And that was one of the arguments against being able to treat you or deciding to treat you as a journalist, which obviously there were, quote, journalists in the Capitol that would never face any charges. Some of them, I guess, had ID badges and that protected them from one reason or another. Can you explain that to people who are like, come on, this guy's just saying he was a journalist just to get off easier?
Yeah, so my background publishing independent journalism prior to January 6th was primarily in the summer of 2020. There are riots all across the nation, and there are riots here in Raleigh where I live. So I was like, okay, I'm going to start doing independent journalism. I'm going to cover these riots because the local mainstream media here wasn't necessarily telling the whole truth about what was going on. And one of the very first riots, I went out and was publishing video. I saw, first of all, they would have all these people going around. If anyone had a camera out, they'd be like, hey, don't film, don't take pictures, don't do this, don't do that. Basically, they didn't want their actions to be documented. But later on in the night, when it had progressed from just a march into some rioting, this was in August of 2020. I saw a crew from the local TV station. They had their cameraman, their anchor, and then or reporter, and then two security guards. And I saw that crew, be attacked by this crowd, these rioters, the Black Lives Matter Antifa. So I was like, okay, if having security guards isn't enough to keep you safe, which I obviously didn't have the resources for security guards. I was like, I'll go the other option, which I believe many other independent journalists did this as well during the summer of 2020, which is, when you're reporting on a riot, especially a violent riot where there is risk to you as a member of the media, basically the strategy is to basically blend in, to have it so that no one knows you're a member of the media, no one knows that you're recording and that your intent there is to publish. And so that was kind of the background in my mind when I was covering the rioting on January 6th is, hey, my experience rioters is that they don't like to be recorded, and they will sometimes engage in violence to prevent that. So, my strategy on January 6th, like it had been for riots in Raleigh, riots on the opposite side of the political spectrum, was to stay safe by blending in. So, at one point, this was in the crypt under the rotunda. So it was basically, a large room, and there was sort of one entrance. And due to the number of people coming in, it was sort of a one-way entrance. Your people were sort of squeezed together to get into this room, and so you couldn't really get out because you were packed together so tightly. And so in that case, I looked around, everyone was chanting USA. There was some violence with people attacking the police. So I was like, okay, I don't really like doing it, but I chanted along with the crowd because I didn't want to be the one person not chanting USA in that room. And, I believe, the latest reporting from some of the mainstream media sources, which I haven't verified, is that about a dozen January 6ers have been charged with assaulting media in one way or another. I believe one AP journalist was dragged down some steps. At one point, people were destroying press gear. So even though there wasn't the same level, there didn't end up being the same level of anti-media sentiment at January 6th as there were at some of the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots, where it was more a much stronger, like, hey, any camera is going to get attacked. There definitely was some of that anti-media sentiment where, members of the media were attacked, especially ones that they perceived to be against them. And now whenever I'm reporting on a demonstration, I try to just record what's going on and not be, necessarily, like by default for or against it. But, I am someone who is willing to call out violence or destruction or the bad things I see going on. So it is what it is.
All right, Stephen, I want to ask you about another piece in that Washington Post article that basically says the prosecutors were looking at Facebook groups, for instance, that you belong to and other people that you were associating with or groups that you were associating with, just to show people how a criminal history is built. I think even if you say, hey, I was doing this for exploratory purposes, or I was there covering this as a journalist, how the government goes back in time and pieces together a puzzle of the kind of person that they want to portray you as, whether that was your intent or not. So we're going to talk about that in a second, because I think it's really interesting and should highlight to people that your searches, the groups you might just be paying attention to, maybe just out of curiosity, not because you necessarily agree or disagree, that you may end up guilty by association in today's climate. However, first, if you're listening to Stephen's story and you're thinking, to get through this, I'm going to need a very good glass of wine, I have just the wine for you. If you go to AllisonWinePromo.com, you get 50% off my favorite wines. These are wines from Argentina, very remote, high altitude. Hey, we're talking about the media's love of extremism right now and the love they share for covering extremists and basically how everybody nowadays is an extremist. But you don't want to go to court, go to trial like Stephen. So then all you have to do is go to AllisonWinePromo.com, and then you can have your extremist altitude wine. You don't have to be a journalist. You don't have to do anything other than have a glass of wine. And I don't think that the FBI is going to prosecute you just yet, but I can't promise anything in the future. The wine, again, is from very small operations, hand-picked grapes, very old vineyards, and just really dang good and a great way to support my work. So if you're already a wine drinker, get it as a present, get it for yourself, get it to apologize to somebody that you unfriended. Because you know what? I saw even the New York Times now is letting opinion writers say that January 6th was not an insurrection. So even the New York Times is allowing people to say that now, that it was a riot. The AP is calling it a riot now. They're not calling it an insurrection. I think that's a very interesting turn of events, and I'm going to ask Stephen about that as well. Okay, so Stephen, let's go back to my original question. I'm going to pull up this Washington Post article again about you. And when I scrolled down to the portion of they're talking about the two different arguments here, how your attorney portrayed you as an independent journalist, that you weren't affiliated with a news outlet, didn't have a large following, but still, Horn and his attorney said his intent to disseminate the recordings he took on January 6th made him a journalist that day. And then under here, they say that Prosecutors used the same video to portray Horn as another person in the violent mob who knowingly trespassed onto government property, saying that you didn't act like other journalists that day, that you didn't ask enough questions of people, and that's what a journalist would do, that you had a camera on your helmet that kept running for 2 hours, but sometimes or often they say pointed away from the action. And then this was the part I thought was also interesting. Prosecutors also focused on Horn's Facebook activity, highlighting that he had previously RSVP'd online to conservative protests in North Carolina and joined groups that supported the theory that the 2020 election was bleep from Trump. In case this video ends up on YouTube, which we're not live on right now, I'm not going to say the word. But anyway, what do you think, Stephen, about all that?
Yeah, so basically in the beginning of 2020 was sort of the first time I really used any social media. So I joined Facebook specifically because of the Reopen NC organizing that was going on. Now, at the beginning of the year, I was not thinking at all about independent journalism or anything like that. So when when they closed the state down, they said we couldn't go to church, couldn't go to work, couldn't even, organize to protest these orders that were coming down from on high. I wasn't too fond about that. So at the beginning of the year, I started going out to some of these Reopen NC demonstrations. And I guess kind of as the year went on, and there started to be this, these Black Lives Matter demonstrations that were turning into riots and how the media was covering that and whatnot, my mindset sort of shifted of like, hey, instead of just like going out holding a sign, kind of boring, usually doesn't do much. Instead, I'm going to use my skills with camera work and whatever I may be able to do to start reporting on what's going on. So some of the groups, that refers to I had joined when I was interested in going to demonstrations. Others were groups that I had joined, just to check out what was going on, or because I saw, other people who I was friends with or interacting with, that they're members of these groups, so they're sharing posts or whatnot. So, personally, I don't like, and I'm like, okay, should I click the button to join this group? I'm not thinking like, oh, am I signaling my allegiance to this group? It's more like, hey, I want to see the posts that are in this group, and I need to join the group to see the posts. So that's what I'm going to do. And, I think they also brought up messages that I had sent on Facebook Messenger with a friend of mine who is very much an ardent Trump supporter. And they're trying to frame some of that as, me, I guess, encouraging his Trump support or whatnot. Personally, I am not a Trump supporter, but, I do interact with lots of people who are Trump supporters. I have a few friends who are Trump supporters, and so they really tried to frame that as like being evidence of my personal support for Trump, which, I have never done.
I have a P.O. box now. You can send me mail if you would like to. You can send me your pocket change. You can send me a lottery ticket. I love getting photos of families and just hearing from you. I've gotten a lot of great letters recently. Really appreciate everybody who sent me support too. And I know there's a lot of people who want to participate and support the work, but don't want to use a credit card online. Totally understand. It's a great way. You can send me a check. You can send me a couple bucks, whatever it is that you want. Like I said, winning lottery tickets only if you don't mind. P.O. Box 3355, Denellen, Florida 34432. Okay, Stephen, let's take some questions over at Locals. AllisonMorrow.locals.com, a great place to support my work as well. $5 a month to go one-on-one with the most censored people on the internet. You get to ask the questions. If you don't like my questions, then just join the editorial board. Then you get to ask them yourself. All right. DMC, is there anything you felt you should not say earlier that you would like to say now?
That's a good question. I guess I've avoided really any criticism specifically of like the court or the jury or even maybe the DOJ to some extent. I guess there's nothing specifically I wanted to say, but it's more that there is, I no longer have to consider that filter of when I'm posting something of, is this going to show up in a court document against me? In their charging memorandum or sentencing memorandum, I believe they did reference a few social media posts I had made and even like marketing material for my documentary. So honestly, I was surprised that they didn't cite more of my posts because I thought I had said, a lot more inflammatory stuff than what they ended up, quoting in their sentencing memorandum. But I guess it's just not having that layer when I post something of, hey, is this going to show up in a future court document? Yeah, there's nothing specifically that comes to mind as something I really wanted to say but couldn't. I've I've talked about the evidence and lack thereof of federal infiltration, of excessive use of force by police, of other topics that might be offensive to the DOJ or outside of the approved narrative, and I will definitely continue to do so.
When you consider a future in doing independent journalism, does this change the way you look at how you do that work? In other words, are you more hesitant to cover particular events? Are you changing the way that you cover them? Have you signed up for a journalism nonprofit to get a badge that says, I'm part of the American Press Association? How has this changed your perspective on that work? And does it make you more likely or less likely to continue doing it?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to continue doing independent journalism. I definitely will stick in the back of my head anytime I'm considering covering a dangerous riot or demonstration, or one which is taking place on private property, or federal building, or some other sort of government building. This whole court case will definitely stick in the back of my mind. I guess I'm probably a bit more cynical of the federal government to some extent, and also just the intent of prosecutors. I think even though on January 6th, I had some beliefs in that regard, specifically in terms of Julian Assange, who the DOJ was going after. He's still in Belmarsh prison as they're trying to extradite him. But I think I've become a lot more cynical in terms of on January 6th. I guess I had somewhat of a naive expectation that, hey, if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm doing something that is morally acceptable, that is in the public interest, recording this riot, that the DOJ will recognize that and not try to come after me. And I guess now I have somewhat of a more cynical view that it it's not necessarily anything about me personally, whether I'm being charged, but this is the whole bureaucracy, and so decisions that are completely unrelated to me might end up being why they would decide to charge me or not charge me. But I will definitely be more careful in the future as I continue to engage in independent journalism.
And this is the documentary that you produce, correct?
Yes, j6documentary.com. It basically lays out the series of events from the initial violence at the edge of Capitol grounds up to where the Capitol is actually breached, and it includes the use of crowd control and flashbangs on the crowd. Specific incidents like Derek Vargo being pushed off the staircase, as I mentioned before. He broke both his legs. That's one story I'm surprised that the more people don't talk about from January 6th, but it covers a whole bunch of events like that, uses a whole bunch of footage from many different sources, and I think it's as unbiased as I can make it. So j6documentary.com if anyone is interested in that.
There you are. Okay, Stephen, anything else you'd like to say before you go that I didn't ask you about?
Nope.